Doctors of Reddit, what made you say how the fuck is this person still alive? An unlucky guy forgot his keys and was climbing back into his own apartment through the window. His cousin friend thought that he was an intruder and pointed a gun at him and pulled the trigger as the unlucky guy opened his mouth to say don't shoot. The bullet went into his mouth and clean exited the back of his neck. After surgery, he was totally fine in a few days, somehow missed all major structures. Didn't even chip a tooth. Really pissed at his cousin. From my neurosurgery rotation in med school. Really pissed at his cousin. That's free beer for life. Hey cousin, you remember when you shot me with a gun? You get this round. A guy I know with cancer smokes 2 packs a day and drinks a fifth of Fireball every day. He lives in a trailer so dirty there is a ½ inch of dirt according to his wife's mother. He recovered from surgeries in that trailer. Eventually we got word he was quitting chemo and was just going to accept death 5 years ago. He was given 2 months to live. He is now completely cancer free. Life is just weird sometimes. His lifestyle was so unhealthy that he managed to kill his own cancer. When I was in college, there was a kid that exited a freeway at near freeway speed. Problem was, it was a construction zone at night, no lights, and it wasn't supposed to be an open exit. Drove right into a pile of rebar. One of the poles went through the car into his face and pinned him to the seat through his head. A couple of years later, I was in grad school, in anatomy seminar, and the surgeon presented that kid's case as a study. Not only did he live, the rebar had slid right past the base of the brain spinal column. It was so close, they had to twist it out like a screw because the ripping on the bar threatened nerve damage. They literally rebuilt this kid's skull around his brain. His recovery photo was a totally normal kid smiling. He had a small scar on his chin. I say kid, but he was like 17, just to be clear. One of my prior patients is a roofer who lived a very full life of alcohol, women, and drugs. He was infected with HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and was psychotic and didn't really care about his health at all. He was ghostly thin and weighed 110 pounds on a 6-foot frame, which included 20 pounds of ascites in his abdomen. He was angry and didn't listen to anyone, refusing therapy most of the time. I met him first in the ICU, where he had full-blown AIDS, end-stage liver disease, hepatorenal syndrome, unexplained lymph nodes all over his body, variceal hemorrhage, Kaposi sarcoma, and spontaneous bacterial peritonitis. Prognosis of in-hospital death was more than 90% even with therapy. I was involved in his care for about 2 weeks and again he refused every therapy that his primary physician suggested. I was surprised he lasted the 2 weeks. Finally, he was so fed up of the noisiness in the ICU that he requested transfer to palliative care and was eventually sent to a hospice for patients with advanced HIV to live out his remaining few days. 1 year later I get a call from the hospice requesting a follow-up appointment for him. I was shocked that he was still alive and asked if I could talk to him. He was all better. Turns out he had the hots for his nurse in the hospice and did everything she asked in order to please her, including taking his medications for the first time. She had slowly nursed him back to health, convinced him to restart HIV meds, put him on a low-salt diet for his liver disease, and then eventually got him up and mobile. He spent another 6 months in a rehabilitation facility, then went back to work. He saw me in follow-up for a while as we treated his hepatitis C, then his cirrhosis shockingly improved. After a couple of years he moved away to another place to start a construction company and became rather successful financially, and remains abstinent on his form of vices. He's the only person that I've seen come back from death. My resident called me urgently one night and said I needed to come to the hospital. A young man was cut in half by a train. I asked why I needed to come in. There was no way he could survive that. She explained that somehow he was maintaining his pressure and wasn't bleeding out. When I arrived, I found that the force of train had sealed off all the major vessels from the pelvis down, crimped like a human tortellini. To that stick out. Guy gets shot in the abdomen. Drops to his knees. Shooter puts one through the top of his head near his forehead. Bullet exits through his jaw. He wouldn't stop complaining about how much he hates that the guy who shot him. Young girl driving a car gets T-boned on the passenger side by an Altima going at least 70 miles per hour. Her car looks like it was hit by an IED, so we assumed she was deceased upon arrival when the other crew on scene said our focus was extricating the people in the Altima. Girl driving was completely unhurt by a Volvo. Kind of retelling, but one time a cadaver on which I was performing an autopsy had a lung which was flipped upside down. When I tried to flip it to the proper position, bloop, it flipped right back to upside down. After some due diligence we realized the lung was a transplant, and the surgeons who performed the transplant had attached the organ incorrectly. The lung had been fighting to be upside down its whole life in this other man. After 15 or so years, the man eventually moved in a way that allowed it to flip over, resulting in his death. Not really a how the F is this person still alive, but more of a how the F did this person live this long with this condition. Had a lady walk into the hospital with her face pointed at her chest. Her C1 vertebra had somehow fallen off C2, with her spinal cord delicately draped across the odontoid process. No damage to anything. Repaired with slow traction and a halo for a little while. Still baffles my mind 5 years later. Older woman called 911 for chest pain. Her vital signs were shit and she had the look that anyone who's ever seen a patient about to die will recognize instantly. Her EKG suggested multiple blockages in her coronary arteries, and we had to put her on a ventilator shortly after she got to the ER because she deteriorated so quickly. Cath lab confirmed the EKG findings, complete blockage of one artery and 99% blockage of two other major arteries. Unfortunately it was too extensive to resolve with PCI, so the only option was to fly her to the university hospital in the city for an emergent triple bypass. It turned out that she'd had multiple episodes like this, but not quite as severe, over the last 6 months and had refused bypass surgery not once, not twice, but 3 times in favor of a Mediterranean diet. Well, at this point she didn't have much say anymore and family agreed, so off to the OR she went. I took care of her again about 4 months later and she actually seemed to have made a remarkable recovery. As a student, had a young guy come in who self-inflicted a 22 to the inside of his mouth and passed out. Awoke the next morning, didn't recall the night prior, went to work. 2 hours into work he says he's not feeling right and starts acting odd. Co-workers call EMS. They take him in and the ED is working him up and in the process notices a mix of clear fluid and blood in the back of his mouth. They call ENT and get a CT head. Shows 11 or so bullet fragments throughout his noggin. The guy was acting by that time completely unfazed. I was very fazed. Working in an Aboriginal community, a woman walked in complaining of a head itch behind her eye. She was told to take a seat and as she turned around she had a butter knife sticking out the back of her skull. Apparently a drunk relative came home and stabbed her while she slept. Edit, yes, she survived. Was flown back to Townsville for imaging, then on to Brisbane for surgery. How strong do you have to be to stab a butter knife through someone's skull? 7 strongs, or 3 strongs and 5 drunks. I helped take care of an old dude who had one leg amputated, and had broken his other leg, so he was seeing us because of that. He was on oxygen and not being very compliant with using his wheelchair. We were talking with him and he was getting really argumentative. How am I supposed to chop wood in a wheelchair was what he kept demanding. When asked how he was chopping wood with one leg in the first place, he responded that he'd crawl into the woods and hop up to chop the wood. This was even more concerning. When the doctor asked how he was carrying his axe, oxygen, and the wood he chopped, he looked him straight in the eye and said, "I carry him on my back." Not sure if he was serious, but he was pretty dang grizzled and looked like he may have been crawling through the woods. Not a doctor. A classmate of mine in HS was out snowmobiling in the middle of the night. He was going about 50 miles per hour down a trail. Some arsehole had put a chain across the trail just to be an arsehole. He didn't put reflectors on it and it wasn't even on his own land. It was on state land. Unfortunately, my classmate had a backrest on his sled. The chain hit him square across his chest. It slammed him into the backrest, which fortunately broke off. He rode back home and crawled into bed. Later, his mom made him go to the local clinic that had a small ER. Their life flighted him down to Duluth immediately. He had a ruptured spleen, part of his liver was torn, his heart was badly bruised, and he had a collapsed lung. He was bleeding pretty bad internally. The doc told him that, if he hadn't been so muscular, he would have died out on the trail. The man was about 6 feet and 245 pounds and ripped like a bodybuilder when he started 6 months and a bunch of surgeries later. He was maybe 130 pounds. He looked like death and his whole chest was railroad tracks. They had to crack his chest twice to deal with his heart and opened up his abdomen numerous times to deal with infections. Now, he's the same loud crazy person he always was. A successful business owner with a wife and kids. Everyone thought he was going to die, including the doctors, but he pulled through. For me it was a guy who was cleaning his loaded shotgun and it blew half his face off, jaw and all. He was actually pretty good from the mid-nose up. The thing that surprised me is how good of shape he was in afterwards. He didn't even go to the ICU, we just admitted him to the med-circ floor. He was up communicating via whiteboard within a few hours and was adamant that he did not try to kill himself. Got a psych consult anyway but they agreed. Another inch dorsal with a barrel of that gun and he would have been done for. This is why you treat guns as always loaded, folks. Even if you personally just unloaded the gun, it is still loaded. Even if it's in pieces on the bench it's still loaded. Even if there is no gun it's still loaded. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe for more AskReddit and best of Reddit posts daily.